Josh Frydenberg delivered the Australian government's economic and financial update today. Essentially what they have done a really good job of summarising what we already know, but not necessarily telling us anything new. It is good to see it all in one place and to understand how the forecast expenditure and reduced revenues for the government will play out, where the focus is. A lot of the value in helping to understand where the government might be going actually comes from a lot of the commentary. And if you have a few hours to read the 180 pages of the document, then you'll find lots and lots of numbers, but the small sections of text, or the sometimes large sections of text, that provide the most insight. And I guess the insight that it provides is that the government is heavily focused on growth. They talk at length about the different stabilisers in the Australian tax system, that when people start to lose jobs, the government takes less tax receipts and starts paying more in unemployment benefits, which helps to stabilise the economy. So it has obviously dampens the impact of job losses. And then on top of that, obviously the government has overlaid specific policy measures and expenditure to increase consumption. One of the major themes that is picked up early through the commentary is the effect of confidence. And reading the government's commentary around confidence, around the introduction of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, while it was really extraordinary policy intervention and support for the economy, it wasn't necessarily done in order to prop up businesses' balance sheets or personal finances. It was done to reinforce confidence. What they demonstrate is that a very strong rebound in consumption, which obviously is a measure of economic activity and driver of economic activity. They saw a huge pickup in consumption starting to lift through June as the lockdowns eased. And that started to unfortunately be dampened a little bit as health concerns in Victoria picked up late June and early July. But they saw the benefits of that in Australia. Also, observing around the world that where lockdowns are ending, there is a return to consumption and expenditure. The media is probably going to focus a lot on debt. It's a number that obviously, or an area where a lot of Australians tend to focus. And what we see with debt, and if they use the headline figure of gross debt, then they'll be talking about a number in the 800 billions, and gross debt as a percentage of GDP exceeding 45%. Now, that's a bit misleading, because what gross debt tells us is how much money the government may have borrowed, but what it doesn't tell you is how much money they have in the bank or how much they've lent to others. So the more telling figure is net debt, and net debt in Australia has been very, very low for a long time now, with a deficit of 4.3% of GDP this year, or in the FY20, and up to 9.7% in FY 2021. We're expected to reach peak net debt of about 677 billion by the end of the 2021 financial year. And that's still less than 40% of GDP. So on world standards, that's incredibly low. So I guess don't buy into the fear-mongering, the media about debt. The other thing that's really important to understand, you have to look a long way through the document to identify this. But because of the reduction in interest rates, and particularly the 10-year bond, which is the average rate that the government is borrowing, so the cost of servicing debt in Australia has dropped considerably. In fact, the 10-year government bond was about 6% pre-GFC, and it's down to less than 1% today. And that may go down even further as the Reserve Bank of Australia is heavily focused on yield curve control, which is the control of medium to long-term interest rates, as opposed to just the control of the overnight cash rate. If we go back to 1995, 96, public debt interest was about 1.8% of GDP. At that time, public debt was about 25% of GDP in total, and we were spending 1.8% of GDP every year servicing that debt. So that meant, obviously, before the government paid for anything in terms of hospitals, roads, infrastructure, 1.8% of the GDP was going out the door. That's a lot of the tax take the government would have been spending on servicing the debt back in 1995, 96. At the end of 2021, despite having much higher debt at closer to 35% net debt to GDP, the public debt interest servicing will only cost about 0.8% of GDP. So that's a lot less than it was costing 25 years ago. So again, there's this heavy focus on the government's debt and the extra money that we're using to pay for all of this stimulus and how we're going to pay it back. Well, the reality is governments don't pay back their debt. When we talk about a budget deficit, what they want to be able to do is obviously have the interest rate or the interest servicing be minimal. The lower that is, and if they can balance their books to have, I guess, their expenses across everything that the government funds, including interest, to be less than the income they're generating from taxes and other receipts. That's obviously where we have a surplus and we have a deficit when we're spending more money on those things. Obviously, the higher the debt that you have, if they've got a very high interest servicing cost, then it makes it harder to reach a surplus. So that's the negative of having government debt. But if you have government debt and it was $10 trillion, but there was a 0% interest rate, well, it's not really a negative, is it? Because if that 0% interest rate was locked in for, say, 100 years, then there's no cost of servicing that debt, so it doesn't impact your budget balance on an annual basis. And again, if we think about it like a house or an investment property, obviously a lot of investors will take out an interest-only loan, provided that the asset that you're acquiring is going up in value or generating an income that over time will exceed your cost of paying interest. If you don't pay off that loan, you're not paying principal and interest, you're just doing interest only, then as the asset value goes up and up and up, eventually the size of the loan relative to the asset and your income becomes negligible, becomes a lot easier to pay it off if you choose to do so in the future once your income has doubled or tripled over 10 or 15 years. That's exactly the way that governments approach their deficits and debt spending. Now again, that doesn't sell newspapers to say that, so we're not likely to read about those things, but that's, I guess, one of the important things to keep in mind when you're reading the paper. So where's the money going? And all of these have been measures that have been announced by the government in the last few months that have just been summarised today. Some of the big ones, they've allocated $130 billion to spend in hospitals over the next 5 years. That's a lot of money being invested into to infrastructure that'll be all around the country. Obviously, that construction expenditure has a really big stimulatory impact through the economy. Obviously, the coronavirus supplement itself will be extended or will still have an impact for up to the next 5 years. Business support, $16 billion has already been committed to small to medium enterprises, instant asset write-offs, backing business investments, which is allowing depreciation to be done at a much faster pace, so allowing 50% of an asset's value to be written off in the first year. A lot of the measures that they've really focused on, other than providing income support, is really focused on investment and essentially trying to get businesses to invest, so encouraging businesses to invest by providing a structure and a framework that allows them to write off assets faster, which means that if they're able to invest and reduce the tax that they're paying, they're more likely to bring forward investment decisions, and those investment decisions obviously increase money flowing through the economy. Similarly, they're spending a lot of money on training. Now, there's so much that could go through, so I've focused mainly on the things that are likely to have a stimulatory effect on the market. Some of the, I guess, more interesting ones that haven't been mentioned a lot, but things that they're doing to support credit flow. So the government's provided a $40 billion coronavirus SME guarantee scheme that runs to the 30th of June 2021. That is essentially they're guaranteeing if lenders lend to loan money to small to medium businesses that meet certain criteria, the government will guarantee some of those loans and provide additional support. So essentially, if the bank ends up losing money on a loan, the government will step in and take over, wear the loss instead of the bank. That's not funding that has to go out the door, because obviously it's not in the numbers that the government's forecasting for expenditure, because it's provided as a guarantee. It's a contingent liability. So that obviously is great if it's supporting investment from the small to medium businesses, which are the engine room of the economy. However, despite the $40 billion scheme being announced months ago, only $1.5 billion has been taken up so far, which means obviously there's a significant amount of I guess, that guarantee that's still available to be allocated. The government's been adjusting some of the parameters for availability, so I guess making it more readily available to more businesses. They felt that it was a little bit too tight, perhaps, and that's why it hasn't been taken up yet. So again, that's one of the really, I guess, if that REIT gets into the economy, that's going to have a really positive impact. Term funding facility of $90 billion for banks at 0.25%. Now, everyone's probably seeing that interest rates on our investment properties are going down, even at commercial interest rates, and on specialist residential accommodation, we're seeing interest rates at sub 3% and down to sub 2% in some cases for some borrowers. But that obviously is supported by these things. Again, the government's incentivising banks to lend to small to medium businesses, and having that type of funding available is going to provide additional capital into the economy, which will get spent, and obviously if it's invested in the right places, will create more jobs and flow through the economy. There's also a structured finance support fund of $15 billion to support smaller lenders providing business and consumer credit. Again, these things haven't really had an impact on the market yet. So a lot of people have focused on the potential end of JobKeeper, and yes, I think everybody breathed a sigh of relief when it got confirmed that it would extend until the 31st of March. In fact, the government expects to spend more on JobKeeper this financial year than they did during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of this support is coming through the system over the next 9 months or 12 months, as opposed to the last 3 months. And a lot of these loan facilities and the credit flow provisions are going to come through in the next 12 and even up to 24 months. It'll be having a benefit on the market. Infrastructure, so just to recap, some of the things in terms of supporting income are short term. We're likely to be weaned out off those by the end of the next financial year. Obviously, for JobKeeper, 31st of March, most likely probably won't get extended again unless there's another flare up and a more stringent lockdown again. But those things were always designed to be temporary. They're not designed to, I guess the government has a fear of encouraging people not to work, so they don't want those policy things to be around for too long. Other things like provision of debt or credit flow and encouraging investment, as well as spending on infrastructure, have a much more longer term impact. So infrastructure, they've already got a $100 billion pipeline of infrastructure investment from the federal government, on top of all state budgets as well. They're increasing $2 billion over the next 3 years for regional and urban infrastructure. That includes $1 billion for shovel-ready projects. Now, a shovel-ready project doesn't mean they're going to spend $1 billion tomorrow. To get to site, it's still going to take months, and then once they're on site, it's going to take months or a year to 2 years to spend the money. There's an additional $500 million for targeted road safety works, and another $500 million for councils for local roads and community infrastructure. Now, post-GFC, we saw local governments spending money on major parks and really transforming some of our suburbs. That has a positive effect on local house prices in those suburbs and can really transform suburbs. Ashburton was a really good example of that in the last 10 years, which was a suburb that had a lot of housing commission throughout, had a landfill site adjoining it. The government spent millions of dollars in GFC stimulus in transforming that, building a new bike path, huge playgrounds and ovals where the landfill site used to be, and turned that housing commission area into one of the best performing suburbs in the state for the next 10 years. So that's the sort of thing that local governments can do with their money when they're providing stimulus. So it has a double impact as well as the job benefits. It's also improving the efficiency of the local area and making places more livable. There's also $1.9 billion to give to the states for major projects. And again, the states will invest more on top of this, and we'll have to keep our eye out for that. We've also seen the home builder package that the government announced in June, that's $680 million. Now, this is really interesting because while they're investing $680 million directly in the home builder scheme, they're expecting that to have a $1.6 billion benefit to the economy by 30 June 2021. Now, that doesn't mean that's the limit of how much benefit it's going to have. That's just how much it will have had by the end of the 2021 financial year. It's obviously going to continue to benefit the economy through the 21-22 financial year, as a lot of people who start building homes won't finish them and may only be halfway through, or even larger projects like off-the-plan apartment projects or townhouse projects may take a couple of years to deliver. So in addition to those, one of the things I found interesting in the commentary was around immigration. So obviously one of the biggest things that the government can do to support housing in Australia, and particularly construction, is allow more people into the country or allow immigration to return to its previous levels. We'd normally have around 200,000 people coming into Australia or moving to Australia every year for the last few years. That dropped to 135,000 in the FY20, and it's forecast to drop to somewhere in the 30,000s for FY21 due to the border controls. Now, some things that obviously is a fairly large reduction. Offsetting that is obviously a big reduction in new home construction. So we're not likely to see a huge surplus of housing, because obviously while fewer people moving in means fewer new houses being built, but also because of the lack of confidence in the economy at the moment, there's been a lot less development occurring, which means less land lots being produced, less apartment projects starting, less townhouse projects starting, and already there's obviously a huge reduction in housing starts, which will lead to a massive reduction in housing completions over the next 18 months. So that kind of automatically balances off against the reduced immigration. Now, what's not picked up is the number of Australians that have been living overseas that move back. Anybody who's already an Australian is entitled to move back to Australia, and there's a lot fewer leaving Australia to go overseas. In addition to that, people who are here on temporary visas are being encouraged to stay by the government extending visa measures for them. So people who are on holiday visas are allowed to work for longer. People who are here on student visas are allowed to stay for longer and to work more hours than they might normally be working. The government's also investing money in encouraging New Zealand residents to move to Australia this financial year. So obviously the government is still heavily focused on that immigration. It's very subtle in terms of you don't find a lot of commentary on this. You need to really look through the detail in this document, but there's obviously support there which demonstrates their focus on immigration. Also, I think there was one line in the document that said they expect that by January 2021, border controls will start to ease and permanent and temporary migration will start to recommence in Australia, albeit at lower levels. Prior to that, they expect to see student visa arrivals to be increasing. So obviously, there's a number of universities have been lobbying for a long time, for the last few months, to allow them to bring students from overseas back into their states and cities to allow them to return to university work. Obviously, it's happening in South Australia, the ACT. I think Queensland's looking at it. New South Wales was, but I think with a pickup in health issues, that's diminished, and Victoria is nowhere near having students coming back to Victoria from overseas at the moment. But again, it just shows the intent of the government on getting migration happening again. Now, one of the things that I've found in the time that this Morrison government has been in, since they got elected back in early 2019, has been an approach where they try to under-promise and over-deliver in the financial measures. Now, that's not always possible because you don't know when they had no idea COVID-19 was going to hit when they did their budget estimates a year earlier. But certainly whenever they are creating schemes, they generally have a bigger budget than they spend, and they generally forecast less benefit than we're actually seeing. And that's, I guess, prudent management. A lot of businesses try to do the same, and it's a good way to run our own finances in any event. A few things that I've spotted that kind of support that. The iron ore spot price in their budget is forecast at $55 per tonne by the end of this year. The current iron ore spot price is $108 US per tonne, which is about double what they're forecasting in their budget. So not only, I guess it might stand to reason that yes, the iron ore price may drop over the coming months, but that's a very substantial drop, and I understand that they've consistently under forecast that. Now, that's not going to make hundreds of $1 billion in revenue for the Australian budgets or for the Australian economy, but it's one of those subtle things that you pick up demonstrating the approach that they're taking in a lot of their forecasts. The other thing that I really, identified going through the document was that they aren't yet forecasting much outside of the 30th of June 2021. So they've tried to limit expenditure measures to the current financial year, and they don't forecast the impacts for very long outside of that in terms of its effect on net debt or gross debt, or the economic situation in terms of unemployment and GDP beyond FY21. They're doing a much more substantial budget on the 8th of October this year, and we expect that that's when they will roll out probably further measures. The approach that they take, which again is good sense in financial management, is to not roll out or project too much about decisions that may come into play in the future. So they've rolled out so far the things that they've had to roll out. They haven't announced a lot of things. There's obviously potential changes to the tax system, to stamp duties and land taxes that may occur in the coming months, and obviously they've got working groups that are trying very hard to resolve those with the states and with unions to come up with IR reform and tax reform that'll help create a pro-growth environment. Now, the pro-growth environment is extremely important because, as I said, if you don't intend to pay down your debt, you need to increase your income in the future and increase the size of the asset, which is the economy for the Australian government. You need to increase the size of that at a substantial enough pace to make the extra debt you've taken on and the servicing of that negligible. So that's what we're expecting to see from October. I think that what they've introduced so far has hit the mark in terms of what they needed to do, and I think moving forward, then we're going to see some more measures that will have more of a medium to long-term investment horizon for the government. Obviously not at the scale they've done to date. I don't think they're going to be rolling out another $100 billion in income support, but $100 billion invested over 5 years, like the $130 billion in hospitals that they've increased the budget funding for, over the next 10 years, I think that might be, then that has great long-term benefits, and I expect there's probably going to be some other things like that. We know infrastructure can't be delivered the same day, like income support can be rolled out within 30 days of being announced. Investment in infrastructure takes years to gear up for, or months to years to gear up for, and then has years of benefit as it rolls out. Not only the immediate benefit to job creation, but also by improving the performance of the economy, the productivity of our industries and so on. So what does this all mean for the housing market? Well, the fact that there's a 16% reduction in housing construction, for most people might think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's a really good thing. And it's a good thing because I own investment properties, and if there's less houses being built in the future, I've got less competition in the future for tenants. So obviously that means that's going to support asset value growth in the future if there's not more things that are available for everybody. What's going to come off the back of that? Well, the government's likely to probably introduce a more medium to longer term investment mechanism to try and encourage more home building. Obviously, we've got the home builder scheme, but that's very, very short term and will bring forward a little bit of consumption for the home owner-occupier. But I expect that they're going to roll out something a little bit more substantial for the medium to longer term, potentially even trying to, as I said, increase the immigration and try to encourage more home building. We know that home building has one of the best impacts on the economy. For every dollar the government spends, it has a multiplier in terms of the value that gets spent from the actual person who's building a home. If the government gives them 20 grand, they spend 500, sometimes as much as that, if it helps them to get their loan and get construction happening sooner. And obviously that creates jobs, it gets money flowing through the economy, which creates more jobs again. So we expect to see some stimulus coming into that, maybe not later this year, but that could be rolled out next year. As I said, immigration we expect to be picking up. It's not a popular thing for governments to talk about, that for them to say that they want to bring back immigration publicly would generally get them lynched by the media or segments of the media. So they tend to do those things fairly quietly, but it's absolutely one of the themes that we're seeing in this budget update, and obviously one of those things that's going to increase demand for accommodation in the future in Australia. So that's demand for rental housing, and obviously upwards pressure on pricing, particularly if there's fewer homes being built for the next year to year and a half. Then obviously as immigration picks up, it'll come into a market that's undersupplied and start to push up house prices again. So I think they're probably the key things the key takeaways from here. As I said, it's a budget that does a very good job of not telling us too much new stuff, but through some subtle references and reading the document at length, you pick up some of the themes of the Australian government, which helps to understand where we're likely to be heading. And I, for one, look forward to the potential reforms that have been talked about for decades and not happening. So I think the economy is primed for some tax and IR reform, and hope that they give it a decent crack in the coming months.